After I left a voicemail for my wife Molly, who I'd been married to for 5 years, I glanced at my phone one more time. I just closed a huge service deal with a major company out here in California, with offices across the country. I knew my boss Brad Hunt would be thrilled. This contract spelled growth for our IT firm and a solid bump in my salary. Maybe now Molly and I could start that family we'd always talked about, but something was gnawing at me. Since I got back from my recent camping trip with Brad, Molly hadn't been herself. She seemed off, distant, and snapped at me over the smallest things. It wasn't just her mood. Right after I got home, I was throwing some laundry in and noticed something odd on her underwear. It had this texture and a strong scent that I couldn't ignore. The realization hit me like a punch and I felt my world starting to unravel. I was desperate to get to the truth. I decided to meet with an attorney before heading back out to the West Coast. If Molly had betrayed me, I knew there'd be no going back. I reached out to a lawyer, Lydia Hammond, who specializes in family law and divorce. She was recommended by a friend who had just gone through a messy split himself. "Are you sure Molly's cheating on you?" Lydia asked as I explained my suspicions. "Not 100%, I admitted, but I need to know if she has. I want a divorce. Divorces here don't typically." Lydia explained that you could file for infidelity, but you need some solid proof, like photographs or videos. "What exactly would I need?" I asked, feeling a pain of dread. "An investigator could find out for sure," she said. I nodded, and she offered to arrange it, since you both earn about the same and you don't own property or have kids. It'll be a straightforward split. If infidelity is proven, we can use that to secure a more favorable outcome. I agreed to go ahead with it. "I'll be away for about 3 days, so it might be then." She got in touch with her investigator, Rick Simmons, who suggested I add a tracking app to Molly's phone and even offered a device to record our landline calls, along with a small audio recorder for her purse. I wasn't keen on doing it, but I needed to know. As the days went by, even Brad started acting differently, like he knew something I didn't. Only made me feel worse. At last, the day came. Molly drove me to the airport, gave me a kiss goodbye, and said she'd call that evening. She surprised me by mentioning she'd be working as a waitress at a party Brad was hosting. One of his regular servers was out, and he'd asked Molly to cover. He'd even offered her $150 for the night. "Okay, but be careful," I said, trying to sound casual. "Just tell me about it tomorrow." "You know I love you," she replied. "I love you too, Molly," I said, feeling a bit uneasy after I called Rick to let him know where she'd be that night. "We'll keep an eye on her and update you," he assured me the next day. I tried calling Molly's cell, but there was no answer. I called our landline, but again just the machine. I figured she couldn't have spent the night at Brad's. I got through the day until an email came from Rick. It said that Molly spent the night at Brad's place. It said she was still there. It was a photo of her with some guys I used to call friends. My hands started shaking as I stared at those pictures. I could hardly breathe, let alone think. I tried calling her again, but only got her voicemail. So I went down to the hotel bar to drown my anger. By morning, I checked the tracker and sure enough, her phone was still at Brad's. Rick's follow-up, I got an email with more pictures showing her with a big group that included Brad's son Matt and several employees from Brad's ID team. There were others I didn't even recognize, probably friends of Matt. I felt sick to my core with the contract signed. I packed up, checked out of the hotel, and I caught an early flight home when I arrived. Molly's car was gone, so I went inside to change. I called Lydia and her receptionist said she'd be able to see me that afternoon. When Molly finally picked up her phone, she sounded a little breathless. "Hey, it's me," I said, trying to keep my tone even. "Where are you?" "I'm at home," she replied, sounding calm. "I'm just wrapping up a few things before classes start." I bit down on my frustration. "I'm finished out here in California and on my way back." "All right," she responded, her tone soft. "I miss you so much. Call me when you land and I'll come pick you up." "At the airport," I replied, "no need. I'll just grab a taxi." I hung up, noting that I hadn't told her I loved her or said anything about looking forward to seeing her. She probably noticed, with a sigh. I left the house to visit Lydia. Meanwhile, I imagined Molly looking at her phone, confused. Normally, I ended every I called to tell her I loved her, but not this time. My voice probably sounded more distant than usual. She'd initially planned to come home after that first night, but lying between Brad and his son felt too enticing to leave. She convinced herself it had all ended when classes resumed and I'd never. So she stayed another night, welcoming Brad back when he got home from work to find her with his son Matt on his bed. Brad just smirked and said, "Maybe I should send your husband on trips more often, you know." She replied, chuckling as if this whole thing was a game, and said I'll be tied up next week, so there's no way I'd do anything with him around. Why not? Brad teased. Maybe he'd like to see what real men do. Brad and Matt laughed, clearly pleased with themselves. She said she'd had a great time, but she didn't want to hurt Mason. She still loved him. Well, maybe she'll make sure he's gone for another at the weekend, Brad suggested. Then you can come and visit us again, she replied with a smirk. It does sound fun. Brad shrugged and picked up a video camera. Don't worry, I'll take care of Mason, but here's the thing, I don't want you with him anymore. You're ours now. Got it all right, she muttered. I'll think something. And just like that, Molly turned into someone I didn't recognize. She was enjoying attention from Brad's friends and colleagues like she was at some twisted party. When I finally saw all the evidence Rick had collected, it hit me hard. There were photos, even 2 DVDs. There were photos of her with multiple men doing things she'd never do with me. It was like watching a stranger, someone unrecognizable in her actions and choices. Lydia tried to offer some consolation, but it was clear there was no going back. Why would she do this? I muttered, still shocked by the betrayal. After 5 years together, Brad was someone I thought was a friend. We'll proceed with the divorce and sue for infidelity. Lydia confirmed that I can also sue for alienation of affection against Brad and the others. It may not go far, but we could get a decent settlement. I said, do what you have to. Hollow, just stay strong, Lydia warned. Don't do anything you'll regret. I won't, I assured her. I'm done here and I can't work for Brad anymore. I can't be around him or those guys. I left Lydia's office, got into my car and scrolled through my contacts until I found Gabriel Nelson's number. Hi, it's Mason Ford, CEO of Empire. Mason here. It's been a while. How are things? I'm not sure if the opening at Empire is still available. I've been trying to recruit you for some time, but I know you've been loyal to Brad, so I'm not sure if you've considered joining us. That loyalty is gone, of course. It's still open, Gabriel replied. Have you finally decided to join a respectable team? I asked. Yeah, something like that, he replied, holding back the full truth. Let's just say I've realized I can't stay where I am anymore. I'm sorry to hear that. Is there anything I can do? I'll give you everything I gave Brad and more, no problem. Why don't you and Molly come over tonight for dinner? Rose makes a lasagna to die for. We can catch up and I'll go over the offer details. I'd love to, but I won't be bringing Molly. Is everything okay? I'd rather explain in person. Gabriel, I replied. Let's just say it's complicated. Okay, he said, clearly concerned. Well, Rose is a certified counselor. If you need to talk, she might be able to help. That actually sounds good, I replied, grateful for the offer. Come around 6:30, Gabriel suggested. I'll see you then, I said, ending the call and feeling a sliver of relief for the first time in days. Sure thing, I told Gabriel, glancing at my watch. Tonight at 6:30. Then, thanks again, buddy, I said, ending the call. With Gabriel's job offer confirmed, the future looked clearer. I started the car and headed home, where Molly was still nowhere to be found. I grabbed my briefcase, stepped inside, and took a long shower after changing clothes. I sat down at the computer to write up my resignation letter around 5. Molly finally showed up, and when she saw me at the computer, she came over to kiss me. I turned away and she ended up awkwardly planting a kiss on my cheek. "Everything okay?" she asked, looking a little taken aback. "I'm not feeling well," I replied. "It's probably jet lag or something." "You're not coming back tonight?" she asked, frowning. "I have dinner plans," I told her. "Are you meeting a woman?" she asked, sounding tense. "No," I replied. "Wondering if I'm cheating on you," I replied. "I haven't cheated on you once in all our years together, and I have no intention of starting now. Can you say the same?" Her face fell as she stammered. "Of course I can." "How did the trip go?" I replied curtly. "Good. How was your little job at Brad's?" "It went well," she said, eyes darting away for a moment. "Even when it was tough, it was fun." "I bet," I replied flatly, glancing at my watch. I stood up. I should go. I saved my work, turned off the computer, and headed to the bedroom to change into something. I came out of the office a bit more formally than usual, and Molly was still sitting on the sofa. "How long will you be out?" she asked, trying to sound casual. "I'm not sure," I replied, heading for the door. "Don't wait up for me," I added, without another word or gesture. She watched me leave, likely noticing that I hadn't kissed her goodbye. Goodbye, or I love you, something I always did. As soon as I pulled out of the driveway, she reached for the phone and called Brad. She had no idea that her every word was being recorded. "Brad, I think he knows something," she said, sounding anxious. "What makes you think that?" "He usually touches me, kisses me, says he loves me. But tonight he was just cold. He said he had dinner plans, but he didn't say with whom." "So what if he knows?" Brad replied nonchalantly. "You can always come stay with us. Don't worry about Mason. I'll keep him busy enough that he's barely ever." "I don't want to lose him, but I'm home now. I still love him," Brad said. "Yeah, sure you do. You've shown us all how much you love him these past couple of days." "Stop," she said sharply. "I know what I did and I liked it, but that doesn't mean I want to lose Mason." Brad's tone was firm. He gave a dismissive look and said, "Give him time. He'll come around. If he doesn't, we'll deal with it. You're ours now, and you'll help us keep things in line. You wouldn't want the school board to see that footage, would you?" "You wouldn't dare," she whispered. "Oh, but I'd love to," he sneered. "I would too. There's plenty of video of you in compromising positions, so you better make sure little Mason behaves." That was the last thing I heard before the recording ended. I clenched my jaw, trying to push down the disgust rising in me as I pulled up in front of Gabriel and Rose Nelson's too. I got the wine from the bottle I'd picked up on the way and rang the doorbell. Gabriel opened it with a smile and took the wine with a nod. "Come on in, Mason. Thanks for bringing this. It'll go perfectly with dinner," he said, leading me into the dining room where Rose was setting up. We sat down at the table. Mason met my wife, Rose. "Rose, this is Mason Ford, our new operations manager." Gabriel introduced us. "Nice to meet you, Mrs. Nelson," I said, shaking her hand. "Please call me Rose, Mrs. Nelson," she replied, with a warm smile. We took our seats and Rose served lasagna while Gabriel poured wine. The wine and food were amazing, and I just had to tell her it was the best lasagna I'd ever had. "I'm glad you like it, Rose," she said. "It's one of my favorite recipes." After a bit of small talk, Gabriel gave me a curious look, so I told him, "Mason, what made you decide to leave Brad's firm so suddenly?" I hesitated. But then I nodded. "It's a long story," I said, collecting my thoughts before sharing everything with them. By the time I finished, Gabriel shook his head, looking genuinely shocked. "Unbelievable," he said. "Mason, something similar happened to me once, though not under these circumstances. So, besides taking this job, what's next?" "I filed for divorce. I told my lawyer it should be a straightforward split given the circumstances." Rose looked at me sympathetically. "Have you considered counseling?" I shook my head. "It's gone too far. I don't even know who she is anymore." "How are you holding up?" Rose asked. "I've been trying to act normally around her, but it's tough." I can barely look at her. You know, seeing a psychologist could help. Rose offered. I'd be glad to talk with you if you're open to it. Gabriel smiled and added. Rose is incredible at what she does. She was a godsend. When I was going through a rough patch, I thought about it for a moment. I'd appreciate that, Rose, I said, nodding. Good man, Gabriel said, patting my shoulder. Take the time you need. Just let us know and we'll work it into your schedule. Over a glass of brandy, we spent the next couple of hours discussing the position, the team, and the projects I'd be managing. By the time we finished, I felt like I was finally taking control of my life again. I shook Gabriel's hand and thanked him before heading home. When I arrived around 10 p.m. I'll be home around 10 p.m. I saw the lights were still on and went in to find Molly sitting on the sofa. She looked up and asked how the meeting went. It went well, thanks. I'm going to bed, I told her. I'm not feeling well. The futon is fine, she said, brushing me off. You were gone for a few days and I thought maybe we could. I'm not in the mood, I said, feeling a wave of disgust just thinking about it. Okay, maybe tomorrow, she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I didn't answer. She turned away, probably wondering if I knew anything. The next morning, I got up early, grabbed my resignation letter and downloaded the audio from her phone call with Brad without saying a word to Molly. I left the house and by the time I reached the office, I barely greeted anyone. I headed straight to my office and started packing up. Brad came in looking confused. What's going on? I handed him 2 envelopes, one with the signed contract from California, the other with my resignation. I'm done effective immediately. I expect my bonus, final salary, and any unused vacation pay. Are you serious? He stammered. Why are you leaving? Don't act like you don't. I replied coldly, I'm not some fool, Brad. I can't work here anymore, so I'm leaving for another company. Wait, can we talk about this? He pleaded. There's nothing to talk about. I thought we were friends, but you stabbed me in the back and ruined my marriage. I didn't force her. Molly was more than willing. Is that what you think? I asked, incredulous. How long has this been going on? Brad leaned back, smirking. Since that camping trip, actually. That second day, when you were skiing, she came to me practically begging. She even mentioned that I'm better than you. So that's why you made me. I left that day to give myself some space. I was angry, and I made my feelings clear. Brad didn't deny it. In fact, he saw it as another chance for some fun. He said, with a twisted grin, that I should hire her as a waitress at the party. I took my phone out and stopped the recording I'd started the moment Brad entered my office. Thanks for your confession. I said, thanks for the heads up, I'm heading down to HR. Bye, Brad, he said, but then he added, hey, wait a minute, you can't use that recording. We'll see about that, I replied. You forgot something. I glanced back to see him holding up a framed photo of Molly that had been on my desk for years. Keep it, I said. If you and your son want her so much, she's all yours. I'm done with that. What do you mean, she demanded after Brad informed her. Yeah, he just handed in a signed contract and resignation letter. Brad explained he knows Miley. I don't know how, but he does. What did you tell him, she asked, panicked. The truth, Brad answered. I told him about our time together on that hike. You idiot. She snapped, voice choked with. Molly was frustrated. She asked Brad, what about the photo of me he kept? He didn't want it, did he? Brad replied, I was told to keep it. I guess he's really done with you. Molly was crying. She asked, what do we do? Brad replied, it's not my problem. Molly said, your husband, you figure it out. Unless, of course, you want me to step in and make him see things our way. No, she whispered. You've done enough. Just stay out of it. I'll handle things. Brad gave an agreement on as you wish and hung up when I pulled into my driveway. I saw Molly's car parked outside. I checked around to make sure Brad's wasn't anywhere nearby, then grabbed my things and headed inside. Molly was sitting on the couch, eyes puffy, and I went into my home office, locked the door, and listened to the recordings of her conversation with Brad. I could hear her unraveling as she tried to explain things with him. It made me feel both vindicated and sick. I forwarded the file to Lydia and called Mason. She answered and said she was finalizing it. I've got your documents now. When can they be submitted? I asked, eager to close this chapter. If you want, I can arrange for them to be delivered later today, she replied, and I thanked her. I hung up and went into the kitchen where Molly sat, avoiding my gaze. I set my briefcase down and looked her in the eye. We need to talk, I said, placing my old I put the gun on the table. She flinched. Is that really necessary? She asked, looking at the gun. I hope not. If your lover decides to pay a visit, I want to be ready. My lover, she stammered, looking genuinely shocked. Don't play dumb, Molly. I'm not in the mood for games. I pointed to the seat across from me, and she sat. I sat down, trembling. Later today, someone's coming by with papers for you. Her face paled. Papers? You mean divorce? That's right. My tone was unyielding. I know everything about Brad's son and the others you were with. She shook her head, denying it. You don't have any proof. She demanded proof, and I showed her the photos and videos I had. Each one showed her in compromising positions with multiple men, including Brad. She dropped her head in realization. She knew her political career would be useless now. Given the circumstances, I think I'm being fair. No alimony, half of what's in the bank, and we'll keep our separate pensions. I've canceled your credit card, and here's a cashier's check for your share of the remaining balance. There's also a restraining order requiring you to stay at least 500 feet away from me, my home, and my workplace was in tears as she asked. So you're kicking me out? Yes, you'll have time to pack up your things before you serve the papers. What if I contest this? She asked, her voice shaking with desperation. I laughed. Do you really think that's wise? How would your school board react if I sent them these photos and videos? Do you think parents would want you teaching their kids? Her shoulders slumped as she nodded. You wouldn't do that, would you? Are you willing to risk it? I asked, my tone icy. She shook her head, defeated. Hand over your rings and plan to revert to your maiden name. I said, it's part of the deal, Molly. She looked at me, stunned. You've become so cold, so heartless. I learned from the best, I replied. What happened to you? How did you go from loving wife to this? She couldn't look at me. It happened on that camping trip. You were on the lake and I was resting in the tent. Brad walked by. And he saw me undressed. He came in, and it just happened. So, some guy walks in and you're ready to throw away everything we had? I asked, in a voice full of contempt, how many times it happened during that trip. She admitted it once when you were skiing and then again when he sent you back to the ice. Shook my head and pointed at the photos. None of these men used protection. You weren't concerned about getting pregnant or catching something. I'm on the pill, she muttered. Don't make it foolproof. I replied, did you ever think about the risks or were you just that reckless? Oh God, no, she whispered, covering. Her face was a picture. Over the years, I'd had opportunities to stray. I told her that women are far more attractive than she is, but I never took them because I thought I had a loyal, faithful wife. Now I realize I was living in a fantasy. I pointed to the pile of bags she'd gathered. Go pack, anything you leave behind will be burned. Or maybe we could try counseling? I'll change, I promise. I stare at her, feeling a numbness settle in. I'll never forgive you for this, Molly. Not after everything you've done. Pack your things. Whatever's left will be gone by tomorrow. Tears streaming, she packed one bag after another, glancing at me. At me one last time. Can you at least help me carry these to the car? No, I replied. It's your trash. You take it. And remember, if you leave anything, even that wedding dress, it'll be gone by tomorrow. My wedding dress. My parents spent thousands on that. She cried. Then you better take it if you care so much. She left, carrying bag after bag to her car. 2 hours later, she was exhausted. I can't fit anything else in the car. Can I come back for the rest? No, you can arrange for someone to get it, but you're not coming near this house. I said. I'll tell my parents. I'll tell them you cheated on me with my boss and several others. She said. It's not my problem. I replied. If you try to paint me as the villain, they'll find out the whole story. Just then, there was a knock on the door. The doorbell rang. I looked at Molly, who was standing there. That's for you, she said, opening the door to a sheriff's deputy. Are you Molly Ford? He asked. Yes, she replied, nodding. You've been served, he said, handing her an envelope. What does this mean? She asked, her eyes filling with tears. It means you have to leave the premises immediately, he replied. She signed the papers and looked back at me. Molly left without another word. I was sorry to see her go. The next few days were a blur, but I didn't hear from her again. Brad called twice, leaving threatening messages. Mason, I know you're there. He barked in one. Drop this lawsuit or I swear I'll. I saved the voicemail and sent it to Lydia, who then contacted the sheriff's department. Molly's parents, Todd and Freya, called soon after, asking if they could pick up her things. I agreed, telling them to ensure she stayed away when they arrived. They tried to convince me not to go through with the divorce. I think I made a mistake, Freya said tearfully. I'm sure you can forgive her. What did she tell you? She had a fight with your boss, Freya replied, clearly confused. I told them it was a lot worse than she made it seem. Mason, Freya whispered, horrified. I had no idea. Todd's face turned red with rage. I'm going to have a word with our daughter, he said, loading the last of her things. They both hugged me tightly before they left. Later that evening, there was another knock on my door. I checked the peephole and saw Brad, his son Matt, and two of my former colleagues. I quickly went to my office, grabbed my gun and called 911, keeping the weapon hidden behind my back. I barely managed to open the door before they came in. Brad was leading the charge. He snarled, stepping forward menacingly. I pulled out my pistol and aimed it right at him, which froze him and his buddies in their tracks. You really want to test me? I asked, my voice steady. Just so you know, I've already called the emergency services. The cops are on their way if you're still here when they show up. You'll all be arrested for violating the restraining order. Brad, I think he's serious, muttered one of the guys, glancing nervously at the flashing red and blue lights pulling up outside. Two officers were already standing in the doorway. One of them took charge and told me to put the weapon down. I did as he asked and placed the gun on the kitchen table, raising my hands in compliance. I then turned to Brad and his friends. These men violated a restraining order, broke into my home and threatened. I'd like them arrested. Do you have a copy of the order? One of the officers asked. I pulled an envelope from the kitchen drawer and handed it over. The officer studied it briefly before turning to the four men and ordering them to turn around and put their hands behind their backs. Brad glared at me, but I just stood back and watched as they were led away. One of the officers asked, Do you have a license for this firearm? Yes, officer, I replied, showing him my driver's license and firearms certification. He nodded and gave me a word of caution. Be careful with that. I understand, thank you, I replied, feeling a strange sense of relief as the police finally left. The next 3 months passed quickly, with life settling into a new routine. I found working at Empire far more fulfilling than my time with Brad's company had ever been. Rose's weekly counseling sessions helped me work through the lingering I was dealing with anger and trust issues, and I'd even picked up a few new habits. I started hitting the gym 3 times a week, joined a martial arts class for mental discipline, and even followed a diet and fitness program that Rose recommended. The divorce itself was straightforward. Molly didn't contest it, but there was the issue of alienation of affection. As for the lawsuits, that was a whole other story. Lydia told me that these cases were tough, but remarkably, 2 of the defendants were eventually fired due to the publicity surrounding the case against Brad. However, the one that shocked us all was the one where we heard testimony and reviewed Lydia's evidence, including Brad's financials. The judge ruled. The judge ruled in my favor, awarding a judgment of $1 million at the end of the trial. He had some strong words for Brad, Mr. Hunt. He looked down at him with clear disapproval, saying, "Your conduct in this case is appalling. Not only did you betray a man who considered you a friend, but you also used your position to destroy his marriage. I see here that you've violated a restraining order multiple times. I'm going to rule in favor of the plaintiff and order $1 million in damages." Brad's lawyer stood up to protest, "Your Honor, but this ruling is highly unusual." The judge shot him a cold look, "But not as unusual as your client's behavior if restitution is paid. He wasn't paid immediately, so he could end up in jail for contempt. Case closed." He banged his gavel, signaling the end of it. Brad clearly won, handed his lawyer a check, which ultimately made its way to Lydia, who passed it to me, to my surprise. The check cleared without issue, allowing me to pay Lydia her share. Word got around about the lawsuit, and a few of Brad's clients reached out to me. They weren't willing to do business with someone who was willing to destroy another man's life. With business drying up, it seemed like Brad was on the path to bankruptcy. I kept my distance from dating, even though a few women at the company showed interest. I was still technically married until the divorce was finalized, and I wanted to do things right when it finally was over. I celebrated quietly with friends from work a couple of months later. Molly's mother, Freya, called me out of the blue. "Mason, it's Freya. Do you have a moment?" she asked. "Of course, Freya," I said, wondering what this was about. "It's Molly," she said. Her voice was shaking. "She's HIV positive. She just got her test results." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, "but honestly, I'm not surprised. We're officially divorced now, so there's nothing I can do." "I understand," she replied softly. "I was hoping you might speak to her. She's not handling this well." I sighed, unsure if it would help, but finally agreed. "All right, Freya. I'll come by for a few minutes." I knew she tried to approach me, but I held up my hand, keeping my distance. She looked sad, so she sat on the sofa and motioned for me to join her. "You look good, Mason," she said, weakly offering a sad smile. "Better than I remember," I replied. "How have you been?" she asked. "I'm doing okay," I said. "Molly, you have a new job, new friends, and a new outlook. How are you holding up?" She looked down and said, "I'm not doing well." She was barely able to meet my gaze. "You know I'm HIV positive now," her mom told me. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said. "Do you know when I think it happened? It was during one of those days with Brad," she confessed. "I was with multiple men and none of them used protection." I nodded and let her words sink in, and it became clear that Brad still didn't know. She replied, her voice barely a whisper, but she'd have to tell him soon. I shook my head, unable to fathom the mess she'd got herself into. "Well, I'm sure you won't take it well," I said, knowing Brad's temper. "No, probably not," she agreed, taking a deep breath. "Mason, I just want to say I'm sorry. I realize now how many lives I ruined. I had the best husband anyone could ask for and I threw it all away. I know you probably hate me and you have every right to, but I don't want to leave this world without knowing if you can forgive me for that." I could see she understood the impact of her actions. She seemed genuinely sorry, and I remembered Rose's advice about forgiveness. Holding on to anger would only hold me back. "Molly," I said, nodding slowly, "I forgive you." Tears streamed down her face as she whispered, "Thank you. You mean more to me than you'll ever know." She took a moment to collect herself and added, "You deserve to be happy. Find someone to love and trust. Have a family and move on." "I will," I replied, appreciating the sentiment. "If you ever need someone to talk to, let me know." She nodded, wiping her eyes. "I will. Thanks for coming, Mason. I've missed you. I've missed the woman I married. By the way, how are things with Brad and Matt? I asked if I could be there when you tell him about your diagnosis." I said thank you, but I need to do this alone. We said our goodbyes, and as I left, Freya hugged me tightly. "Thank you, Mason." It meant a lot to her and to me. A couple of weeks later, while I was eating dinner, a news report caught my attention. Local businessman Brad Hunt, his son, and an unidentified woman were found dead from what is thought to be a murder-suicide. The anchor announced that the authorities are investigating and will release more details soon. I froze, reaching for my phone and dialing Freya. She answered, sobbing. Freya, I just saw the news. Was it her? Mason, she choked out. Brad shot her, then his son, and finally himself. Oh my God! I'm so sorry, I whispered, feeling a wave of sadness. I know, Mason, she said, her voice breaking. I think she told him about her diagnosis, and he snapped. They're doing an autopsy now. I never wanted any of this, Freya. I hope you know that. Thanks for making peace with her, Mason. I like to think she's at peace now. I hope so, I said quietly. Let me know if there's anything I can do at Molly's memorial. I was there with her parents, paying my last respects. The autopsy revealed that Brad and Matt had both been HIV positive, apparently. When Brad and Matt learned they were HIV positive, everything spiraled. Molly had tried to suggest they all get tested, but upon hearing the news, Brad had snapped, taking her life, his son's, and finally his own. It was tragic, and it all felt so it was all so senseless. I spent the next few days reflecting on everything, mourning not only the loss of the woman I once loved but the life I thought we'd share. Our good years lingered, a bittersweet reminder of what once was. Then, one day, as I was getting ready to leave the office, Tracy, one of my coworkers, stopped by. I was approached by a colleague. Hey Mason, she said with a warm smile. The hell with that, I said, smiling back at her. I could use some good company. Well then, she replied, her smile widening. Let's catch up at Hitchhiker's after work. As she left, I leaned back in my chair, a strange but welcome sense of peace settling over me. The cycle of life continued, and for the first time in a long while, I felt ready to see where it might take me next.